Well, this happened. It was a pretty famous director wanted to do a PSA for colon cancer, and he asked me if I'd be game for this, and I said, I would. And my doctor.
For years, millions of viewers watched Mike Rowe do what most people would never even consider. He crawled through sewer systems, shoveled waste, worked in extreme heat and freezing cold, and handled animals, machinery, and environments that were as dangerous as they were unpleasant. Week after week, audiences laughed at his jokes and admired his willingness to get his hands dirty. But behind the humor and the fearless attitude was a reality few people truly understood. The jobs weren't just uncomfortable, they were physically punishing. Over time, the toll on Mike Rowe's body began to add up in ways that even he hadn't expected. Broken bones, deep cuts, infections, burns, and injuries that required stitches became part of the journey. What looked like entertainment on television often came with real consequences. And while the show celebrated hard work, the cost of telling those stories was sometimes painfully high. To understand how it all happened, you have to go back to the beginning, long before dirty jobs became a global hit. In the early 2000s, Mike Rowe was not yet the face of one of television's most recognizable series. At the time, he was working as a host on a local program called Evening Magazine in San Francisco. It was steady work, but the show itself was struggling. Ratings were declining, audiences were losing interest, and there was a growing sense that cancellation could happen at any time. Producers and hosts alike felt the pressure. They needed something fresh, something that could capture attention and bring viewers back. But finding that kind of idea wasn't easy. Television executives often demanded originality, while simultaneously fearing anything that seemed too risky. During this uncertain period, Rowe and his colleagues began experimenting with different types of segments. They knew they needed something bold, something that would stand out from the polished, predictable content that filled most television schedules. Around this time, Rowe became fascinated with the idea of immersive storytelling. Instead of standing on the sidelines and interviewing people, what if the host became part of the story? What if he stepped directly into unfamiliar environments and learned by doing rather than observing? It was a simple concept, but it had enormous potential. As brainstorming sessions continued, another idea began to take shape. Rather than focusing on celebrities or glamorous professions, why not highlight the people whose work often went unnoticed? The laborers, technicians, and specialists who performed difficult, messy, and sometimes dangerous jobs every single day. These were the kinds of jobs that kept cities running, food on tables, and infrastructure functioning, but rarely received recognition. The more they talked about it, the more the concept made sense. Eventually, they decided to try it. The early segments were rough and experimental. There was no guarantee audiences would respond, and no one involved could predict what would happen next. But almost immediately, something clicked. Viewers were fascinated by the honesty of it all. There was no pretense, no glamour, just real work, real people, and real challenges. Rowe's willingness to struggle, to laugh at himself, and to admit when he didn't know what he was doing made the segments feel authentic. Within months, these experimental pieces began drawing attention. Ratings improved. Local press took notice, and some of the segments even earned industry recognition. For a moment, it seemed like everything was finally moving in the right direction. But television can be unpredictable, and success doesn't always guarantee stability. Not long after the segments began gaining popularity, changes in management brought a new direction for the show. The gritty, messy approach that had started to attract viewers was suddenly viewed as unsuitable. Executives worried that the tone might alienate a broader audience. The instructions were clear: move in a different direction. For Rowe, it was a frustrating realization. The very idea that had begun to breathe life into the show was now being pushed aside. But instead of abandoning the concept, he began to think bigger. He realized that the idea might simply be in the wrong place. If local television wasn't willing to embrace it, perhaps a larger network would. Determined to give the concept a real chance, Rowe began sending tapes and proposals to networks across the country. It was a bold move, and it wasn't easy. Rejection after rejection followed. Some networks never replied at all. Others declined politely, saying the concept didn't fit their programming needs. A few responses were almost humorous in their bluntness. For many people, that kind of rejection would have been enough to give up. But Rowe kept going. Persistence eventually led him to reconnect with people in the industry who understood unscripted television and were willing to consider unconventional ideas. With their help, the concept was refined, strengthened, and pitched again, this time with experienced producers involved. The process wasn't quick. Pilot episodes had to be filmed. Executives had to be convinced. Focus groups had to be studied. Every step required patience and determination. Finally, after months of uncertainty, a network decided to take the risk. What began as a small experimental idea was transformed into a full television series. When Dirty Jobs premiered, few people expected it to become the success it eventually did. The premise was simple. Spend a day working alongside people in some of the toughest, messiest, and most unusual professions imaginable. But the simplicity was exactly what made it compelling. Each episode introduced viewers to workers who took pride in their craft, no matter how unpleasant or difficult the job might seem. And at the center of it all was Mike Rowe, not as a distant host, but as a participant. He didn't just watch, he worked. That commitment made the show stand out. However, what viewers didn't always see were the risks involved. Many of the environments featured on the show were inherently dangerous. Heavy machinery, hazardous materials, extreme temperatures, and physically demanding labor were part of the daily reality for the workers, and now for Rowe as well. At first, the injuries seemed minor. Cuts, bruises, and strains were almost expected, but as the seasons went on, the physical toll became more serious. There were accidents that required medical attention, burns that took weeks to heal, deep cuts that left scars, moments when exhaustion pushed the body to its limits. And yet, filming continued. Part of what drove Rowe was a deep respect for the people he worked alongside. He often spoke about the importance of skilled labor and the value of hard work. For him, Dirty Jobs wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to highlight professions that were often overlooked or misunderstood. But even passion and purpose couldn't completely shield him from the physical reality of the work. Long days of filming in harsh conditions began to wear on his body. Recovery time between shoots was often short, and the schedule left little room for rest. There were times when the strain was almost overwhelming. Still, the show's popularity continued to grow. Viewers connected with the authenticity of it all. They saw a host who wasn't afraid to fail, to struggle, or to laugh at himself. They saw workers who took pride in their craft, despite the challenges. And they saw stories that rarely made it to television screens. Dirty Jobs became more than just a show. It became a cultural phenomenon. It ran for multiple seasons, earned award nominations, and inspired spin-offs and international versions. What had started as a risky idea in a struggling local program had turned into one of the most recognizable reality series of its time. But behind the success, the physical and emotional demands never truly went away. The injuries accumulated quietly, one after another. Some healed quickly, while others lingered. And there were moments that didn't always make it into the final cut, when the danger felt very real. Moments when things could have gone very differently. Moments when the line between entertainment and real risk became impossible to ignore. As the years passed, the strain began to show, not just physically, but mentally as well. Constant travel, unpredictable working conditions, and the pressure of maintaining the show's authenticity created a level of stress that few viewers could imagine. For Rowe, the experience was both rewarding and exhausting. He was proud of what the show represented, proud of the people it highlighted, and grateful for the opportunity to tell their stories. But the cost of telling those stories was higher than most people realized. And eventually, that cost would begin to shape the next chapter of his life in ways no one could have predicted. By the time Dirty Jobs had been on the air for several seasons, the excitement of its success was undeniable. The show had gained a loyal following, and Mike Rowe had become one of the most recognizable faces on television. But while audiences saw the finished episodes, carefully edited, often humorous, and filled with fascinating stories, the reality behind the scenes was far more demanding. Filming Dirty Jobs was not like working on a traditional television program. Each episode meant entering a completely new environment, often with little time to prepare. One week could involve working in extreme heat around heavy industrial equipment, while the next might mean spending hours in tight, filthy spaces where the air itself was difficult to breathe. The physical strain was constant. Rowe has spoken openly over the years about the injuries he experienced during filming. There were moments when accidents happened quickly and without warning. Slips on wet surfaces, unexpected impacts, and exposure to harsh conditions that left lasting marks on his body. Some injuries healed within days, but others took much longer. And then there was the exhaustion. What viewers didn't always realize was how relentless the production schedule could be. Travel alone was grueling. Crews moved frequently, often with little downtime between shoots. Recovery time, the time the body needs to heal, was often shorter than it should have been. At first, Rowe pushed through it, like many of the workers he featured on the show. That was part of the philosophy of Dirty Jobs. Show up, do the work, and keep going. But over time, the wear and tear began to accumulate in ways that couldn't be ignored. There were days when simply getting ready for another shoot felt harder than it used to. Muscles stayed sore longer, minor injuries lingered, fatigue became more noticeable. And yet, the show continued. One of the reasons Rowe kept going was his deep respect for the people he met along the way. The workers featured on Dirty Jobs were often doing physically demanding labor every day of their lives, not just for a few days of filming. Many of them worked long hours in difficult conditions with little recognition. Rowe often said that telling their stories mattered, and that belief gave him the motivation to continue, even when the work itself was difficult. But there was another side to the experience, one that was less visible to the audience. Spending years in challenging environments, constantly pushing physical limits, and living on an unpredictable schedule can take a toll not just on the body, but on the mind as well. The pressure to maintain the quality and authenticity of the show was always present. Dirty Jobs had built its reputation on being real, and that meant Rowe couldn't simply stand back and observe. He had to participate fully, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous the task might be. That commitment was part of what made the show special, but it also made it exhausting. As the years passed, the question of how long the pace could be maintained became harder to ignore. Eventually, after 8 seasons, Dirty Jobs came to an end in 2012. For many fans, the cancellation came as a surprise. The show was still popular, and its impact on television was undeniable. But behind the scenes, the decision reflected a combination of factors: changes in television programming, shifting network priorities, and the reality that a show built on physically demanding work could not continue indefinitely at the same intensity. For Rowe, the end of the series marked the close of an important chapter of his life. But it was also a moment to reflect. Looking back, he often spoke about what Dirty Jobs had taught him, not just about work, but about people. He had met thousands of workers across countless industries, each with their own skills, challenges, and stories. He had seen firsthand how much effort goes into the everyday things most people take for granted. And he had also learned something about himself. Years of physically demanding filming had left their mark. The aches, the scars, and the memories of close calls were reminders of how far he had pushed himself. While he remained grateful for the experience, there was no denying that it had been physically and mentally taxing. In many ways, that was the quiet tragedy of dirty jobs. Not a single catastrophic event, but the slow accumulation of strain over time. It's the kind of tragedy that doesn't always make headlines. There's no single moment to point to, no dramatic turning point. Instead, it's a story of endurance, sacrifice, and the hidden cost of doing something meaningful but demanding. After the original run ended, Rowe didn't disappear from public life. He continued to work in television, narrate documentaries, and advocate for skilled labor and vocational training. In fact, one of the lasting impacts of Dirty Jobs was how strongly it shaped his mission to promote the value of hard work and the importance of trades. Through his foundation and public speaking, he began encouraging younger generations to consider careers in skilled trades, careers that are essential but often overlooked. In a way, this became the next chapter of the journey. Instead of just showing the world these jobs, he began working to change how people think about them. Years later, Dirty Jobs would return for additional seasons, proving that the interest in these stories had never really faded. Audiences still wanted to see the people who keep the world running, and Rowe was still willing to tell those stories, though with the wisdom and experience gained from years of doing the work himself. Experience had changed things, and perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. When people look back on Dirty Jobs, they often remember the humor, the unforgettable scenes, and the remarkable workers who appeared on the show. They remember the laughter, the challenges, and the moments that made them appreciate the unseen work happening all around them. But behind those memories is another story, a quieter one, a story about perseverance, a story about pushing limits, and a story about the real cost of stepping into some of the hardest jobs in the world, day after day, for the sake of telling the stories of others. Mike Rowe's journey wasn't defined by a single tragedy. Instead, it was shaped by years of demanding work, physical strain, and the realization that even the strongest people have limits. And perhaps that's what makes his story so powerful. Because in the end, Dirty Jobs was never just about dirt. It was about the people willing to do the work and the price that work sometimes demands.